Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So we've been looking at the 4th chapter of this text. And just to recap really quick, if you want to pull up on your phones, laptops, we're looking at the Book of Assistance by Imam Al-Haddad, rahimahullah. You can just Google Book of Assistance, PDF, it'll pop up for you. And we're on chapter 4. And this text essentially creates a roadmap for its reader to spiritual increase. And the mode in which the content is presented is very easily digestible chapters. They're very short, but they have a lot of meaning to them. And we've been going through each chapter pretty slowly. We've been doing this on Monday nights. The last 2 weeks we did it on Wednesdays. But we're getting back now into the academic semester starting here, and so we'll be going back to our normal kind of routine from next week, inshallah. We'll have iftar after Maghrib, then we'll do the halaqa, and all the rest of our programs will be starting as well. At the end, I'll kind of remind people what that looks like for this week and going into next week. But each week we've been delving into these chapters in a little bit more detail to just extrapolate an understanding and see where it is that we can then implement for ourselves. What Imam Al-Haddad does in chapter 1, he starts out with yaqeen, a deep certitude in faith. And the idea is that he's giving us a destination point. That each one of you is not any of the rest of you sitting in this room. And we think about this not on a theoretical, but on a practical, that concretely, all of us is different from the rest of us. And we're not in a place where that's necessarily meant to be isolating or create loneliness, but this is a religion that doesn't embrace this kind of rugged individualism that modernity imposes upon us, but it still appreciates individuality. And within that, you recognize that you and the person next to you have your own strengths and non-strengths in terms of both what is ritualistic, what is spiritual, what is ethical. But Imam Al-Haddad is giving us what a goal is in terms of having this deep faith in chapter 1, yaqeen, so that even though our starting points are all distinct, we have a common endpoint that we can work through as we work through the text. And that yaqeen, if we were to summate it, is essentially the way that you have reasonable faith in many things day to day. That you know likely when you go to your home that you turn on a faucet, water's going to come out of the faucet. If you came into this space today, you know that likely there's going to be lights that are illuminating the space. And then when Khalid, who is doing our camera stuff, I'm not talking about myself in the third person, but the other Khalid was hitting the buttons and the lights were going on and off and on and off. Fundamentally, we know that we hit that switch that is going to turn the lights on and off. Having yaqeen is having a deep faith in the divine, and everything that then stems from that God-centric faith. You believe in that the way you believe the lights will turn on when you hit the switch. It makes sense? And then chapter 2, he goes into niyyah, intention. That this is a roadmap. So he's saying, before you take a step, you know why you're doing what you're doing. And then it creates now a metric of assessment that isn't necessarily rooted in anything self-deprecating, but just as any journey that you know that if you turn the wrong way, you can assess it based off of what it was that you had as parameters of the kind of map you outlined, of the steps you were going to take. So you go back and you revisit your intention to make sure that you're actualizing what it was that you had actually intended. Or if you need to realign intention, but you have presence and mindfulness. You're not just a body walking around. You're not just a stomach that's walking around. You're not just sexual organs that are walking around, but you bring intentionality to what you do. You know why you're going to do what you do before it gets done. He then talks in the 3rd chapter about muraqabah, which is translated as vigilance, but you're essentially looking over your heart, so your heart looks over you. And you have it now as a vehicle that has an awareness, a consciousness of the divine, That paradoxically though, if you haven't made a choice of who you know Allah to be for you, you still have made fundamentally, in the absence of a choice, you've chosen. And our tradition teaches us to not just believe in a God that's watching us, but watching over us. A God that loves you more than a mother loves its child, a God that looks for a reason to accept from you rather than pushing you away. And that muraqabah is to have an acute awareness of that God. Not a God that makes you walk on eggshells or with trepidation or paralyzes you. And all of these first 3 chapters are rooted in actions of the heart. And then we go into the 4th chapter that we've been looking at these last few weeks, that's on the inner self and the outer self. That still fundamentally connects to the heart, but now introduces to us ourselves as an entire being, and these 2 realms now that are not necessarily separate of one another, but they have synergy, that which is outward and that which is inward. And so we talked about a bunch of different things in relation to this, and you can find all the recordings online, but that defining these terms is important. We have a psychological framework rooted in our tradition that talks to us about the spiritual heart, the qalb, and its layers, the sadr, the outer layer, the qalb, the fu'ad, the place of emotions, the lub, kind of the center of it all. We talked about the nafs, we talked about irada, sheer will and determination, aql, the intellect, the ruh, the soul. We also talked about your inner self incorporates like your thoughts, your feelings, your memories. There's so much that we can say is encapsulated within you inwardly when we're talking about everything that exists in the world within you, and having a tangible relationship with something that's intangible but still begins with a part of definition, making it concrete because it's real even if you can't hold it. And then understanding what it means to have an outer self. And then getting into, last week we talked about some of the keys of the outer to the inward and the ways that shaitan can enter through some of these keys, right? The jawarih, the limbs that can become now entry points to the inner self. May Allah protect us from shaitan's waswasa. And then today we want to get through the rest of this chapter on the inner self and the outer self. And then from next week, we'll start the new chapter on awrad, on litanies, devotions. But there's so much more than that, right? It's a chapter that's essentially on like management of the self through time management, having structure to your schedule, increasing in barakah by having things that are essentially outlined and mapped out in this structured way, inclusive of like a daily, what we call wird, right? Recitations of Quran, adhkar, dua, these kinds of things we'll talk about next week. And so we're in the middle of this chapter. Can somebody start to read from where it says, know that the one who claims to have a thriving inward? Anybody?
I'll read.
Go for it, yeah.
Know that the one who claims to have a thriving inward, but whose outward has been corrupted by his abandoning outward acts of obedience, is a pretender and a liar.
You keep going. Yeah.
The one who exerts himself in the reform of his outward aspect by caring about the way he dresses and appears, speaks, moves, sits, stands, and walks, but leaves his inward full of repellent attributes and vile traits, is one of the people of affectation and ostentation, who have turned away from the Lord.
Okay, so here Imam Al-Haddad is now giving us something that has very obvious meaning to it, that we've also kind of brought up a little bit before in our conversations. And I want you to think about this now, though, in the terms of how so much of what we can discuss in terms of spiritual increase is rooted in conversations of the inward. But in this first part, he's creating a link now in terms of a recognition of the importance of having also a sound outward state. In our tradition, both of these things go hand in hand. And Islam is a religion that deeply appreciates beauty. Right? Our tradition teaches us that Allah is beautiful and He loves those things that are beautiful. These are not rooted in societal understandings necessarily of what's normatively understood to be beautiful. Because when you live in a supremacist society, it teaches you that you have this spectrum subconsciously of whiteness and blackness. And it's built itself up now off of anti-blackness. It gets us to a place now where we have considerations of beauty, where likely many of us are not going to be the ones whose faces grace billboards. Not because we're not beautiful enough, but because societally we are purposely ingrained in our psyche this notion that we are going to be compared to what is the norm, but never the norm itself. And if you remember when we talked about intentions, we talked about core beliefs. Right? And we have different ways cognitively that we function, and your core belief structure is kind of at the foundation, and then you have intermediary beliefs that creates rules and assumptions, and then you have thoughts and behaviors that are the fruits of those intermediary beliefs. So a core belief could be positive or negative. I am beautiful, I'm not beautiful. I'm worthy of success, I'm not worthy of success. You can have an intermediary belief that now builds itself off of that thing. That if I were married, people would like me. You can see a manipulation in terms of what we're talking about here. So if I had a negative core belief, or I instilled within you a negative core belief, that rendered to you an understanding that said you are not beautiful. You don't see characters that look like you on TV. You don't read books that have people that are the same color of your skin. I was with a friend of mine the other day who was from the Caribbean. And my kids are, my wife is born in Chennai in India. She's a convert from a Hindu background. She converted like 25 years ago, mashallah, well before I met her. She's probably practiced Islam longer than I have. And my family, we're Kashmiri. We grew up, my family, after partition, my dad moved to Pakistan. So we're like brown people. And my friend, who is from the Caribbean, he's also brown, but he's a brown guy who grew up in the Caribbean, and his family's in the Caribbean, but they all still watch like Bollywood films. And I said, do you understand Hindi or Urdu? He said, no. And he said, growing up, they had one channel, and he was so annoyed because everything would stop because people would go watch these movies that they couldn't understand the language. And I said, well, why do you think they were doing that? And we talked about it for a bit. And fundamentally, the idea was that it was one of the few times they could turn on the TV and see somebody that looked like them on television. And they didn't have to know the language. They didn't have to understand like the 4-hour movie plot and why were these people like running in fields and singing and dancing and all these things. They were just affirmed in their sense of self because someone who looked like them was also on that television screen. A manipulation of this can be rooted now in one of these negative core beliefs. I am not worthy of success. I am not worthy of love. I am not beautiful. And it creates an intermediary belief. If I had lighter skin, then I'd be beautiful. An entire industry then builds itself out in parts of the world through the manipulation of this core belief that are skin whitening creams, that are all kinds of surgical practices, but they're rooted in the idea of creating a false sense of what outward beauty actually is, in making you have a despise for yourself. Does that make sense? Yes. But the Quran says, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created humanity in the most beautiful of forms. Now I want you to think about this though from the standpoint of what is external. Because quite often when we think about things that are worldly, whether we are the most practicing people or not, we think about dunya in a way that we detach it from the creator of dunya. This is still a part of creation. And if you try to detach this world from the creator of the world, it doesn't mean that the creator of the world did not create the world. And when you walk through this world and you try to make sense of it through a detached understanding, then it becomes easier to place certain judgments on things in terms of what is beautiful. Allah is the creator of black skin. Allah is the creator of brown skin. Allah is the creator of white skin. Allah is the creator of short people, of tall people, of people who are heavy, of people who are light, of people who have blue eyes, brown eyes, every color of hair. The Creator created all of these things. And the inner state that has obedience will recognize in the outer the beauty that is there. Do you get what I mean? And that's not just in the beauty of the other, but also of the beauty within oneself. When we have these notions now of what it means to be outwardly beautiful, you have to bring specificity to this definition the same way a few weeks ago we started to delineate a definition of what does it actually mean to me when this word inner self, this construct is presented. Outer self, what does it mean? Not somebody else's language, but what is it talking about and how do I understand that? And then you can find there's room to have outward beauty in pretty much everything. And you could apply it to anything and everything. But it starts within oneself. The outer beauty is about rooting yourself in a recognition, firstly, that you are beautiful. And then when you get out of bed and you walk through the streets, you think about the Prophet ﷺ. And you think about every part of his day and every part of his week. And you think about every depiction of who this man was, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do you think that his clothes were ever unkempt? Do you think he was ever in a place where he literally just rolled out and kind of walked around in that way? You could go to different parts of this world. I just went to Zanzibar. We were in the Bahamas after, where there are Muslims and there are masjids. Some of the most beautiful masjids I've ever prayed in have been some of the most simple masjids, and some masjids that have existed for centuries. But there was historically an appreciation of aesthetic beauty within this religion and what it taught people. Not in a weaponizing way that sought to elevate oneself by denigrating somebody else. It's inner and outer. You can't have a state of inward arrogance that weaponizes religion to go and size up everybody while they're in prayer. You are pulling on their sleeves. You are like pulling their shirts. That's not what our religion teaches us to do. I'm saying though that once you can start to build that inner self, the reflection of the outward is going to be in something that brings within it now what renders actual beauty. You could see somebody pray their prayer, and you could tell that their prayer is not being done with an inward state. Right? The hadith that says, don't pray like a rooster. Don't pray like a camel. Right? Just bobbing up and down at the ground. I have children, my 7-year-old, my 10-year-old. I love them to death. My daughter, when she was little, she used to like climb these monkey bars in Washington Square Park like a beast. She was amazing. Upper body strength like I've never seen. Still got it. Sometimes I'm walking, I don't know how this game started, but I'll be walking and all of a sudden my daughter Medina comes and she just like hurls herself at me to try to knock me down. I'm like, what are you doing? And then she'll laugh and snort. I'm like, please stop. This is like so scary. My daughter, I don't know, when she was like 6 or 7, I saw her like running. She was a little kid, but as she got older, I saw her running again. And then we had the pandemic, so there wasn't a lot of time. You have a Manhattan apartment, where are you going to run around? So, you know, make excuses. And I saw her running, right? And I stopped her. And I was like, Medina, baby, you run so funny, right? And she said, Baba, what do you mean? And she was running, and it looked like so strange and awkward. And I said, my child is not going to run like this. And she was like, Baba, you're being mean to me. But she was laughing. And I was like, I'm not being mean to you. I'm like, you're my baby girl. I cannot have you running in this way. It does not look right. You probably have friends that are like this, who when you've seen them like play sports and they try to shoot a basketball and you tell them you should never shoot a basketball in your life. My friend Omar Bajwa, great guy, he'll tell you himself. He can speak English amazingly. He speaks Urdu. And I asked him, have you ever given a talk in Urdu? And he said, I did once. Somebody encouraged me to do it. And they said, you'll be great. And then I gave a lecture in Urdu, and at the end of it, the guy came up to me and said, you should never give a talk in Urdu. You can tell sometimes when the outward is not being performed in the way that it should be performed. Right? You can look at certain things, and you can say, that's not what that thing should look like necessarily. This is a tradition that's about understanding that beauty that exists outwardly is also as important as beauty that exists inwardly, though you cannot root it in what this like false sense of beauty is here. Do you get what I mean? We're not talking about the overt kind of compensation for pain people have. We're talking about what exists within our tradition's understanding of what is beautiful. I want you to think about this now within yourself. You think about how you learned Islam, how you approach Islam, and how do you understand this essential value of what is beauty? Whether you root it in ihsan, which has a root of beauty, right? Hasan. That which is Jamal, like beauty in that sense. Like you come into this space, and I still walk in here. I was the first person that came in this building. My name is signed in the concrete of its foundation when they were building it. And I would be in this room before anybody came in, and there's like, I still walk in. I said to him, to Khalid the other day, isn't this room so nice? It's not like fancy and lavish and these kinds of things. Do you know what I mean? But it evokes a certain sense of beauty nonetheless. Like it makes sense. That outward has to have that sense as well. Like when you make wudu and you see somebody who really knows how to make wudu, and they're really present in their wudu. Not that you should like creepily stare at people when they're making wudu. But if somebody's really making their wudu in that way, inwardly and outwardly, it's gonna look nice when they're making wudu. When you see like people praying individually or praying all together, in the way that our prayer is meant to be performed with its mechanics, it's going to look beautiful. You think about spaces you've visited, you can stare at the Kaaba and the tears just fall out of your eyes. You can be in places where you think about, like, what is it that really renders a satisfaction of the heart, because what you're looking at isn't unnatural. It isn't something that's forced. It doesn't seem like somebody's trying too hard. Do you know what I mean? And so Imam Al-Haddad, he's saying that your inward has to be something, that if you're claiming that it is, but your outward is engaged now in these acts of disobedience, that also fundamentally there's no beauty in the engagement of haram. Then you get to a place where you start to understand the link between these two things. Does that make sense? And I gave this example, I think 2 weeks ago, where my son, he really wanted to watch this movie that had this song that he had been listening to, and he was excited to watch it, and they turned it on, and I had left to go do something. When I came back, I saw my son Kareem, and he was sitting on the couch, and I could tell that he had just cried. And I asked him, "What's wrong?" He said, "Baba, nothing's wrong." And I went over to him. He's my baby. I can tell. So I picked him up and I said, "What's going on?" And just a short while before in the movie, the young boy who's kind of the protagonist, who has his own kind of learning challenges and is a little bit on the spectrum, his father gets angry, yells at him, screams at him, and then strikes him in the face. And Kareem, at 7 years of age, he had never seen a father hit a child before. And his inner state could not then really hold everything that it was now taking in through this outward act of ugliness. The two just couldn't coexist within him, and the tears started pouring out. Why would a dad do this to his kid, Baba? How could a father do this to their child? And the same example I gave you before, where the idea isn't that because we become desensitized to it, its exposure makes sense. But your heart is meant to be attracted towards things that are good and beautiful. Not towards just those things that bring satisfaction to the lower self, but things that appeal to the higher self. And so in an understanding of starting to define that, for me, what does that mean to me? It's a simple tradition. You have a Prophet ﷺ who slept on a mat that left marks on his back. He didn't have so much. This is not a question of finances. It's not a question of wealth or privilege. It's about recognizing inward and outward. What do these things mean, and how do we then understand what it means to have an outward sense of stability? All of these different realms now have these states. And the state of what exists external has now a relationship to what is internal, but the outer can tell us. Now, I want you to think about this, right? Not because you're putting on a show for anybody, but you think for yourself, right? Is there beauty in my salah? And if you struggle with it, you're learning how to do it, that's totally fine. The hadith, it gives us the fundamental principle. The one who struggles with reading Quran, there's more ajr in it than the one who can read it fluently. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about knowledge that you have. We're not talking about knowledge that you don't have. I'm talking just fundamentally thinking about this in terms of some of our base ritualistic relationships with the divine, as well as how it is that we take on the day, each and every day. And where do we find a relationship to this idea of what outward beauty is really supposed to be about? Does that make sense? What I'd like you to do, because I know I'm talking a lot, is just turn to the person next to you, ideally in pairs. But if you got to talk in more than a pair, then no more than 3, so that everybody gets to talk. What are some of the things you're taking away from this right now, in terms of just what we're talking about, beauty that is outward? In whatever way, what is it bringing up for you? And then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things that are coming up or we're taking away from this? Any thoughts? What are you talking about?
Pigeons.
Pigeons. Okay.
Yes. Well, you know how they are, I was just talking to them how Washington Square Park filled with them.
You were talking to the pigeons in Washington?
No, I'm not a crazy pigeon lady, don't worry.
I don't understand.
No, we were just talking.
You were talking to them about
pigeons?
Oh,
pigeons.
Sorry, yeah, go on.
And how, like, when they're, like, walking around, New York City is filled with them, and they're kind of annoying time to time when they attack you. But that's not the point. So I was sitting today during Asr, and I was watching the park, and I see there's, like, a flock of pigeons, and they were just, like, making different kind of shapes, like, while they were flying around, and that was
circles
really
and stuff.
Yeah, and that was, like, really beautiful. And I thought about then how during fall a bunch of birds know how to go to the south where there's, like, a warmer climate, and I thought about how nature, like, Allah created nature in a way that it knows how to navigate through the world. And I thought about, like, why sometimes us have a hard time to do so. If that makes sense.
Yeah, subhanAllah. Yeah, I mean, some would say that when those birds are kind of moving in those ways, you know, that's how they do their dhikr of Allah, right? And quite often you'll find, right, my son, my daughter, when they see the birds, they'll say, Baba, the birds are praying around us. You know, it's a time to pray. But kind of going into your point more too, like, if you really engage in the creation of Allah, it's really hard to find anything ugly in Allah's creation. Like, you spend time with the creation, you reflect on the creation, you go and let yourself be in different places so that you can experience different facets of creation, and you're gonna undoubtedly find beauty in everything, right? There's nothing without meaning in Allah's plan. And there's nothing without beauty in Allah's design. Quite often when the rest of creation ends up being in unnatural modes of existence, it's not intentional on their part, but in large part it's because we as humanity are not living the way humans are supposed to, and then it has this domino effect on the way everything else lives, you know? What else? What else are we talking about? What else comes up for people? Yeah.
One thing that came up is like a question, is what about, like, inauthentic beauty kind of fools us on a regular basis? It's like, we know that someone is doing something wrong. It's quote unquote like charming to us, but we could just get fooled by all the time. So it's like, how do you prevent getting fooled by that on a regular basis?
Like what?
It's like, there are, like, charming people out there. They have, like, you know, good looks, good quality, like, on paper, but inside there isn't anything good about it. But we get fooled by that, like, pretty often.
Why is that? Why do we think? Yeah.
Just speaking from a professional perspective, they always say you put on your best outfit, you do your hair, your makeup for an interview, because people are also more likely to trust or put their faith in someone who's a bit physically attractive, or in some way, it doesn't have to be even attractive, just like put together, because that's how people start, like, trusting you. It's also like a psychological thing. And
Yeah.
we do studies on it, actually.
And that's how all these chapters are linked to each other, right? Intentionality necessitates a wakefulness of the heart and the mind. And when you're running on default settings, you're going to run now on stereotypical understandings and process things very instinctively, but there's an intellectual laziness. Many will assume that somebody, based off of how they look, it's directly proportional to whether they're a nice person or not, or they're a bad person or not, right? And yeah, go ahead.
So, there's a line by the great lyricist J. Cole. There's beauty in the struggle, ugliness in the success. And we were kind of talking about sort of this deceptiveness of, like, bi-coastal beauty obsession, right? Like in New York, in Los Angeles, in these places, these metropolitan areas, the superficiality is kind of what we strive towards, whether it's Times Square or Wall Street or high-rises. And it captures you, and you hustle to get there, and you put more and more into it. And it's an addiction, and it kind of just keeps you going and going and going, and it's like quicksand.
Yeah, and if you ever look at some people, right, like really look at them, you'll find that some people who are quote unquote supposed to look beautiful, they don't really look beautiful at all. That this entire chapter is making a link between the inward and the outward. And you can see on people's faces the kind of actions that they undertake. And it's not necessarily about the other so much as it's what's going on in my heart that prevents me from being able to see the actual state of things around me. I don't want to be a person who walks into my home and I'm so exhausted inwardly that I can't tell that my son just cried, or that there's something on my wife's mind. The Prophet ﷺ, there's hadith where he can tell, right? The companions are in a place where he says to them, like, what is going on with you? And they say, you talk to us so much about Dajjal. And then they get into something about the Dajjal. May Allah protect us from his fitna. But in understanding, though, the Prophet is connected to the people around him, that he doesn't need for them to say, I got something on my mind. He can already tell that there's something that's going on with them. These are functions of the inner. You have to define for yourself in unequivocal terms that certain things are just always ugly. Gossiping, never beautiful. Being racist, never beautiful. Abuse, never beautiful. Lying, cheating, backbiting, deception, never beautiful. The blocks that bring us to these things, we have to somehow comfortably engage inward. But if the outward is telling us what the state of the inward is, you got to be honest with yourself to be able to recognize both your capacity to exist. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ. It's the paradox of the self. Within you and I is capacity to be an agent of beauty and an agent of ugliness. May Allah make us people of beauty. You're not going to be a person of beauty if you don't appreciate what beauty is. You don't take a pause to breathe and say, what does this word even mean? And do I really honestly believe in a beauty that is only rooted in that which is external? I'm not saying you shouldn't cut your hair. You should. And you should style it and look nice. I'm not saying you shouldn't wear scents and perfumes. The companions asked the Prophet ﷺ about wearing nice clothes, wearing perfumes. Is this an act of arrogance? No, that's not what it is. Don't be simplistic in it. But at this stage in your life, you have to be able to define concretely, what do these words mean? And if you don't design your life, somebody else is going to design it for you. And if they are not in pursuit of what you claim you believe in that is otherworldly, and they only want this dunya, they're going to get you to hate yourself, or believe that a willingness to engage for the sake of the acquisition of the world is worth it at the sacrifice of both what is inward and outward. Do you get what I'm saying? What are some things that are always ugly? What are some things that are always beautiful? Helping others, that's beautiful. You should want to help others. Being kind to others. You read the hadith through these prisms. Giving salams to those that you know and those that you don't know. Holding the door open. Giving up a seat for someone. Food for one is enough for two. Food for two is enough for four. And all of these is an inherent thread, outwardly, that's reflective of a distinct sense of inwardly what is really beautiful. Do you get what I'm saying? If you've never thought about it, just sit and think. And how much of my day is spent in pursuit of a beautification that is now seeking validation of what is both individual and systemic to make me believe that I am never good enough. versus a God who tells his angels, when they find that you didn't pray all of the fara'id of your prayer, he says, go and see if they prayed anything extra. That's who your Lord is. And he knows that you are beautiful. He just wants you to recognize your beauty. It's not rooted in having children or not having children, or having a house or not having a house, or being married or not being married, or having this much wealth or not that much wealth. Your prophet buried most of his children. He lived in a house that you can go and see that is so small. It's not big. But he just emanated an outward that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. You see what I'm saying? It's not a tradition that teaches you to focus one way or the other. It tells you that both are important. And you start to prioritize the relationship between the two by defining then, what does this outward state of actual stability look like? And not in societal kind of frames that bombard you with coupons at the end of December so that you can then create resolutions to just sign up for a membership that after a few weeks you're not going to ever use again. You are beautiful whether you go to the gym or not. You just have to recognize, am I living in the way that was intended for me to live? One who claims to have a thriving inward, but engages in outward acts of disobedience. The Sheikh says, he's just a pretender, he's a liar. Now you want to deepen in that. Why would somebody lie about something like this? It's not always because you're a bad person, but you carry a lot of hurt inside sometimes. Sometimes I can't tell you what it was like for me to be a child. Sometimes I can't tell you what it was like when I went to school. Sometimes pretending is the only option that I have to find some semblance of just sensibility in a world that's been chaotic. Everybody's carrying a lot of mess inside of them, is the default you want to have, so that your default is one of kindness and compassion. And it's an act of spiritual nature that you choose to be in a place where there is a sense of recognition that this person has lived an entire life before I met them. So this might be why their outward is the way that it is. That I don't jump to just reach conclusions. This is where a reductive understanding of Islam that doesn't relate text to context and says, let's just take what is most literal and apparent, teaches now a pedagogy that can be challenging because it says what I see is what must be. There's literal hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he says that the Quran was revealed in 7 modes. And he says within each of these, each verse has a outer and inner meaning to it. And this is authentic hadith. When they do commentary on this, some of the mufassirin of hadith, the muhaddithin, they say that what likely is meant by this is that verses have an apparent meaning that could be understood by many, and then a more subtle meaning that necessitates you getting into it a little bit more to take from it. But everything has these things. That means also everyone has these things. And it's not the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ to just judge based off of what is most apparent. But he gets to know people as a way to help them getting to know themselves. He gets into a place where he allows for people to be able to struggle. You want to have a standard for you. I want you to think about people who you know are just good people. The word khalq in Arabic refers to like our outward, our appearance. Khuluq is your inner. Akhlaq is the plural of khuluq. when you see certain people that bring you a sense of hopefulness. You see certain things that make you smile. What are those things? And if you're attracted to things and the virality of it, where somebody was kind to someone, there was this amazing act of mercy that just went all over the internet, and you like to see that, good, take it as a metric that your heart is where it needs to be. If you enjoy watching people punish other people, that's a problem. I'm saying it to you from love. If you're in a place where you validate somebody's hatred, real hate, that's also a problem. Understanding yourself now and thinking about this from the outward to the inward. When he continues now, he gives us some specifics. And he says, the one who exerts himself in the reform of his outward aspect by caring about the way he dresses and appears, speaks, moves, sits, stands, and walks, but leaves his inward full of repellent attributes and vile traits, is one of the people of affectation and ostentation who have turned away from the Lord. If we just focus on that first part, some of this also, though, requires us to understand that it's not that you absolutely don't think that this is something of importance. It's not the only thing, though. So you should be thinking about your outward in terms of how you dress and how you appear. You should be thinking about your speech and your movement, kind of posture and these kinds of things. Not to a point of paranoia, but it's not to belittle. Even within the mechanics of what we do. These are spiritual exercises that are time-tested over centuries. So the ways that they have been prescribed are not so that you can look at somebody and tell them, that's wrong, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. But it's an exercise. You do it the way that it's intended to be done, so it yields the most output and gain. So it makes a difference where you are kind of oriented in the mechanics of things and knowing the mechanics of it, but being in this place where you also understand outside of ritual that these are important things to just think about as well. There is a spiritual master in our tradition who walked around in clothes that were nice, wore like great scents. There were others who claimed to be more esoteric in their relationship with the divine, more spiritual, quote unquote, and they wore clothes that had patches on them. I'm not knocking anybody in terms of the state of life, but they were purposely choosing an understanding of a state of inward that said, I have to be in a place where I just deny my engagement of the world in these ways. And they said to the sheikh, what kind of sheikh are you of spirituality? Look at how you are dressed, and look at the nice clothes that you wear, and the foods that you eat. And he said to them, not in a haughty way, but when people see you, and you purposely are like this, they're going to think you have a lot more needs than just the need of Allah. And when they see me in this way, they're able to understand that all I need is Allah. I don't have to fake it or feign it. He's got his gifts that Allah has given to him. He's using those gifts. Do you see what I mean? The other thing here is a recognition that is going to look different from group to group. If the hadith says that the entire world is a masjid, and you can pray then pretty much anywhere in the world, save the places that we're not supposed to pray, bathrooms, toilets, etc., the entire world is a masjid. The hadith says this, right? There's a hadith that says this. That means you can pray anywhere in the world, which means then people can pray anywhere in the world, which means that people can be Muslim anywhere in the world. So some aspect of what is outwardly acceptable is going to vary from place to place. So when you meet somebody who's different, the goal isn't to make them become you, because your inner is going to be reflected in your outward. And quite often, the insecurity that stems from somebody being different is rooted not in that I have a challenge with you being you, but unless you are like me, I now have anxiety because I don't know how to be me unless everybody is just like me that's around me. Then you don't have deep-rooted conviction. You're just common in what is shared externals at that point. Do you see what I'm saying? People are going to dress differently, and it's going to work in different parts of Muslim experience around the globe. People have different practices, different norms. We weren't made to all be the same. Allah is the creator of our diversity. And so what is going to be understood as being something that is outwardly beautiful is going to change from place to place. What might be something that's a little bit different in terms of posture, in terms of dress, in terms of walk and demeanor, it's going to vary from place to place. I was in Sri Lanka speaking at some things, and there was a journalist that was interviewing me. And every so often, I would say something, and this journalist would shake his head when I was talking. And I would say something, and then he'd just keep shaking his head, and then I'd say something, and he'd shake his head, and then after a few minutes, I was like, hey man, am I saying something bad? Like, why do you keep shaking your head at me? And he was like, I'm not shaking my head. And I was like, yes, you are. You just did it again. And then I said to him, here in Sri Lanka, when you agree with somebody, do you go like this? And he said, yeah. And I said, where I come from, when you agree with someone, you nod your head. You don't shake your head at them. You shake when you disagree. It's a different place. I'm not from there. And I don't need to have a sense of entitlement that is, again, an inward challenge that suddenly believes that my standard is what everything gets compared to. If you're in this community, you have both the blessing as well as the challenge. It's not a negative, but it's a challenge that, unlike most Muslim communities that are ethnocentric, one legal school of thought, one theological school of thought, you are going to have people in this community that come from all walks of life. Distinct theologically, legalistically, every race, every culture, every ethnicity, every social class. And there's lots of people that see the IC as their space. And it's an ample opportunity to then understand the depth of what lived experience can be, because you talk to people who are different from you, and you broaden perspective in that way. As he continues in this paragraph, and he's talking now about the focus on the outward, and where and how we can relate this to ostentation and affectation. This is a very important thing to understand, because you have kind of sins that are outer and sins that are inner. And some of the things that have outward manifestations, they're quite often sometimes a little bit easier to remedy than things that have inward roots. So the vile traits that he is talking about, the things that he alludes to, they're sometimes a little bit more concrete, right? Because you could tomorrow, God forbid, engage in the outward sin of drinking something you're not supposed to, or smoking something you're not supposed to. Somebody could peer pressure you into it, and you get to that place, but a minute later you come to your senses, and then you engage in tawbah, and you turn back to Allah, and it can even bring you closer to Allah. Right? This is why our teachers tell us that the dua of the sinner is quite often more precious than the one of the saint. Because the sinner knows what it really means to pray for something and to ask for forgiveness. Does it make sense? And so, in this, the outward act can have a different categorization than the inward of arrogance, God forbid. May Allah protect us from it. Miserliness, greed. And you can get to a place where the remedy for what is outward is pretty simple. You just turn and you ask Allah for forgiveness. You have that remorse, and you seek His assistance to overcome the habit, the addiction, whatever it is. But when the inward sin, the inward state now is what is being acted upon, a vile trait, as Imam Al-Haddad is calling it, those aren't as easily then kind of dealt with consequently. And that sense of now ostentation, that sense of arrogance, you don't want to think about what that state is. Then your inner state can have multiple frames of existence. It's not just something that is in a place where it's static and it's continuous, but it's something that's dynamic. You can oscillate, you can be a product of different environments, different people around you, but being able to understand that there are still things inwardly that can be rooted in things that are problematic. And then as he closes this chapter, beware, O brother, of doing in secret that which if seen by people would make you ashamed and worried about being censored. A Gnostic once said, a Sufi is not a Sufi unless were everything that is in him to be exposed on a plate in the marketplace, he would not be ashamed of anything that came to light. If you cannot make your inward better than your outward, the least that you can do is to make them equal, so that you behave equally well privately and publicly in obeying God's injunctions, avoiding his prohibitions, respecting what he has made sacred, and hastening to please him. This is the first step a servant takes on the path of special knowledge. Know this, success is from Allah. So I want you to just take a minute and this last paragraph, you pull it up on your phone, if you have it in front of you. What do you take away from Imam Al-Haddad as he's closing this chapter on this paragraph? Like, what are some of the things we can pull from it, and then we'll come back and discuss. Okay, so what are some of the things we're taking away from this last part? What do we talk about? Anybody? Yeah.
That if other people were to see what we do secretly, would we be ashamed of it, or do we want to share it with others, or would we want to hide it? For example, sometimes when I'm talking bad about other people, and you never intentionally, you tell yourself, oh, it's not ghibat, but you just start by saying, oh, someone did this and this to me. That's how you start talking about other people, right? And then I tell myself that, oh, I hope, what if the other person found out about it, And I hope to come to a place where when I'm talking about other people, if they heard me without my knowing, I won't be ashamed about it. Or if they heard me, the things that I've said about them, they won't feel hurt. I hope that I come to that level.
Okay. Other thoughts? What does it have to do with the text? You're the reader of a text that's like a manual. It's a how-to. Right? And he's prefacing this with, beware of this. Why? Like, why is he telling you to be wary of it, to be mindful of it?
Because if we're ashamed of other people seeing it, and like when we're exposing ourselves, what we were doing in private, and we're ashamed of what we did, what about Allah, who is all seeing and all hearing? Like, why we're not ashamed in front of him, and we're ashamed of its creation, if that makes sense?
It makes a lot of sense. What is it doing to you? Like, what does it give to you, practically speaking, this first sentence?
Your inward and outward has to be same. And if it's not, then there is work that needs to be done. If you're praying in Jummah and it's not the same as your tahajjud, if your Jummah prayer is very slow and very beautiful, and your tahajjud is like pecking, and your fajr at home is like you're just quickly going, then there's something you need to do to reflect that both those things are exactly the same.
If you walk by a house and it says in the front lawn, beware of dog, why is it telling you to be aware of the dog?
Don't walk in.
No, but why? Why is it telling you to be aware? Huh? Yeah, the dog is going to then have some type of impact on you if you're not aware of it, right? So it's literally saying, be aware, there's a dog, right? Be aware, this is like a school zone, don't drive super fast. So here you have a metric, because the wariness is not about the outer but the inner. This is hurting you. And if you want to know as a metric that something is not good for your heart, then think about it in the way that if people knew you were doing this, how would you feel? Do you understand? So you start to just engage in reflection, which is not self-deprecation. But if I'm starting to think about the things that come from me, not that are imposed upon me, but that come from me. I don't really want you to know that I yell at my mom so much. Maybe your yelling is not anger, it's sadness. May Allah grant you ease and healing. And everything that's bad for your heart doesn't mean that it's because you're bad or you're doing wrong, but that yelling, it's still impacting your heart. You understand? I don't want people to know that I sit at home and I just cry to myself. Doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it's still impacting your heart, those moments. Do you get what I mean? Let alone then, if you're sitting at home and you're doing all kinds of things that you just know are not things that you should be doing. Religion gives you privacy. That's your right. We're not talking about it in terms of this is my life, this is my body, this is my this is my that. We're talking about it as this is your soul, this is your heart. You're going to get out of it what you put into it as a criteria now of just wariness. You have this metric of assessment. It's not a blanket generalization, but you apply it back in your own inventorying. Hey, if people knew that this was going on, would I be okay with it? Why not? In those conversations, sometimes it's important to have somebody that you could talk them out with. So you don't have shaitan using those entry points that we talked about last time, that gets in your head and tells you that, hey, it's wrong if you tell somebody that you're being abused. Do you get what I mean? But using this now, which requires a lot of vulnerability, and this is why everything goes back to God in our religion, and you have to decide, do you believe in the God that God introduces you of himself to be through his book, or from somebody who stands on a pulpit that tells you that God's an angry old man in the sky looking for a reason to punish you? And then your vulnerability and your willingness to take on certain things. So have this understanding. The individual who's now engaged in that mode of inward is not somebody who's perfect, because perfection is a futile pursuit. This religion doesn't tell you to be perfect. If anything, it tells you that in your imperfection there's beauty. Your ability to recognize and be comfortable, not indifferent, but comfortable with your capacity to make mistakes. To really think what it means to have a God that if you were a creation that did not make mistakes, did not sin, he would replace you with those that did, so that he'd have a creation to forgive. And these are not, words are important. What they're saying is that if everything within you was put on a plate in the market, you would not be embarrassed by that. But you get to a place where that sense of balance, inwardly and outwardly, you find reconciliation, right? So when we talked about the fu'ad, and we said, like in the Quran, when the mother of Musa alayhi salam is spoken of and the anxiety she feels putting her child away, they talk about the fu'ad. You reconcile feelings, you reconcile experiences. I'm not sitting here telling you terms that the inner self is just the nafs and irada and qalb and aql and ruh, but you have memories, you have thoughts, you have experiences. The world doesn't need to know your business, but you have a right to contentment. That means that the hardest of your experiences, as well as the easiest and everything in between, you're entitled to be in a place where you can reconcile, heal, and move forward from those things. The affair of the believer is unique, the hadith says. When difficulty befalls, he patiently perseveres. When something good happens, he praises the divine. In both, it is qualified, there is good in it for him. That's hard when you got to do this sometimes on your own and make sense of things on your own. Because then you can convince yourself of anything. Do you know what I mean? And I think what's amazing is that when he speaks about things like this, he still uses the kind of, terms of endearment that, oh my brother, right? And you gotta think, the Prophet ﷺ, he has a love for people. You talk about like people who struggle with alcohol, zina, these things we use. The Battle of Uhud, the archers leave their post. We lose at Uhud. So if you're not familiar with it, there's archers that are stationed on a mount. If you go with us for Umrah, or maybe inshallah Hajj, we don't know what's happening. But we're in a place where we'll take you to Uhud and we'll show you where the archers were stationed. They were told, don't leave. And then they left. They saw others collecting now the kind of bounties of war. And when they left, right, the flanks of the mushrikeen at that time had Ikramah, the son of Abu Jahl, and Khalid ibn Walid. And then they turned the tide of battle. And there are so many companions that we lose in that battle. The Prophet's uncle Hamza radiallahu an is lost in that battle. There's a lot of devastation. His blessed face sallallahu alaihi wasallam is pierced. His kind of teeth are damaged. There's blood dripping from his cheek. When it's all said and done, the archers don't get excommunicated from the community, do they? He doesn't line them up and say, how could you have left your post? But kindness is the default. He's sent as a mercy to the worlds. There's this sense of kind of endearment, a sense of connection. His uncle died. His uncle who believed in him, when so many of his family members did not support him, who was from amongst the first in his family to embrace his religion and stand up for him from his family. And he still has space for these people in his community. You get what I'm saying? And so the reading of it has to be one that just reads the words. Why would the sheikh write here, oh brother, if he was looking to distance himself from the one that's struggling in these ways? Do you get what I mean? O brother, of doing in secret that which if seen by people would make you ashamed. And he says, if you cannot make your inward better than your outward, the least you can do is make them equal, so that you behave equally well privately and publicly, in obeying God's injunctions, avoiding his prohibitions, respecting what he has made sacred, and hastening to please him. This is the first step a servant takes on the path of special knowledge. Know this, success is from God. right? So it's now interjecting also like movement, right? Because these first three things, yaqeen is a destination, you haven't taken a step yet. Niyyah is inward intentionality, you didn't take a step there, right? Muraqabah, you're kind of aware, but you're still not moving as such, right? Now you're in a place where there's giving kind of a step on the path. Does that make sense? So we'll start next week from the next chapter. I want to take a pause here.